Okay, good afternoon everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're very excited to present our March lecture this afternoon, but before I do that, I just wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping items. So as you've noticed, if you've been coming over the past couple of months, we are offering CEUs, but in order to get your CEU, you need to sign in and then sign out as well. And I'll go ahead and give you the certificate of completion on your way out. So please make sure you do that. And then we also have, next to the sign-in, a evaluation form, and that really helps us to improve as we go along here and moving forward. So I think I tried to distribute some of those, and if you don't have one, you can just grab one after the lecture and quickly fill it out. It's only 3 questions, I think, so it's really helpful to us, though. In addition to that, I just wanted to let you know that as you noticed, we're being filmed here, and so we mostly Clay and myself. But if you ask a question, we'll ask you to use the microphone so that we can all hear that and that we can hear it on the video as well. Those videos are posted on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/PBHJP, and then they're also available for comment on our blog. So that's an attempt to really encourage some community dialogue around these topics and give folks who weren't available to come today a chance to view the lecture and comment if they choose. Other than that, as you know, we have the lecture series monthly, so the next one will be in April. It will be presented by Sarah Walker, and the following one is in May, presented by a panel on military families. So we are very excited about both of those coming up. Stay tuned. I think that does it for housekeeping, so I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Dr. Clayton Cook is an assistant professor of educational psychology at the University of Washington. His primary research interests are the development and implementation of multi-tiered response to intervention service delivery models. In particular, he's interested in development and validation of school-based universal screening and progress monitoring, design and implementation of interventions to address common emotional and behavioral problems in schools, and transferring what we know works from research to improve the social, emotional, and academic well-being of students to real-world settings in education. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Clayton Cook.
Thank you. My goal is going to be to keep you alert. It's after lunch, and so if you are entertained and alert, I will have succeeded in my mind. I'm here to talk about school-based mental health, and there's a lot of reasons why mental health should probably be delivered through the school setting, and hopefully I can touch on some of those. And then we got to think about, we have a lot of knowledge about what works. The issue is actually to get people to use that knowledge. How do we translate that into real-world settings? So in addition to being a faculty member here, I consult with education systems across the United States on actually translating evidence-based practices and getting them up and running. Currently working with 8 school systems nationwide on doing this. Some of the school systems we've been working for over 3 years, and they're rocking and rolling. We do universal screeners. We have less than 5% of kids who are detected as having needs that go above and beyond universal prevention, the universal level of support. When we started, 35% of kids were detected as in need of additional supports. It just so happens when you develop a comprehensive Tier 1 universal support system, man, kids' issues kind of evaporate in many ways because their needs are being addressed in a supportive, nurturing environment by adults who relentlessly build relationships with them. And it's such a buffering effect that it can overcome some of the adversity kids experience outside of school. Schools are the common interface in a community. This is where communities gather, yet it hasn't been traditionally viewed as a place to deliver mental health supports. The whole Field of Dreams approach, you build the clinic and they will come. Ooh. The vast majority of kids who actually need mental health supports don't get them. Less than 15% do. If you can build the capacity to deliver mental health supports in schools, over 98% of the kids who need them get them when they're delivered within the school. So it's about access. and it's about delivering those supports. I hope I talk about some useful things to you all today.
Do you want questions along the way, or?
If you would like, yeah.
I'm just curious,
Yeah.
because a vast number of youth that have high levels of needs are the
Yeah.
ones that aren't actually in school.
Yeah.
Are you going to touch on how?
I'm
you
going to
bring
talk
them
about systems change,
Okay.
fundamentally as my work, and I'm going to talk about belief systems, and this is all about readiness to take on evidence-based practices, because we have a lot of belief systems that support ineffective practices whereby the kids who need it aren't at the educational table because they've been ostracized and ripped out of there. I'm going to talk about beliefs as a precursor to dissemination of evidence-based practices. Most people with an evidence-based lens come and force feed down schools, here, do this, it works, believe us, trust us. They don't establish the beliefs. Beliefs determine how we behave and why we behave. Why do you do what you do? So think about educators. What are their belief system? And it could be completely skewed, and it's not supportive of these evidence-based practices. And what happens when you measure their beliefs and they're unsupportive, you try to get them to adopt evidence-based practices. What happens? They don't adopt them. So I'm going to talk about the effort we engage in. It's called belief, knowledge, skills, and procedures. You do not start the knowledge and skills of the evidence-based practices until the beliefs are on board. And so I'm going to model for you how we tackle beliefs. How we tackle beliefs. And this is system-wide beliefs. So many of us know about motivational interviewing, right? It's working with a client. How do you do that on a systems level, where you're working with people in different guilds, an entire environment where there's multiple parts that are supposed to be working together to best meet the needs of kids? How do you do it from that framework? We say belief systems. It's a cultural element to the school. So I think I'll read, this is the only thing I'll read to you, straight off the slide, but for century after century, all the way into the remote millennia of its origins, education got along by sheer guesswork and the crudest sort of empiricism. It is hard to conceive of a less scientific enterprise among human endeavors. It was, in retrospect, the most frivolous and irresponsible kind of human experimentation, based on nothing but trial and error and usually resulting in precisely that sequence. Education has been a non-evidence-based field. It hasn't looked to science, it hasn't looked to defensible evidence to guide what is adopted, what money is spent on, and ultimately how people practice. And that is still true today in many respects. Yes, there's policy that say evidence-based. Yes, there's What Works Clearinghouse, which is kind of funded by the U.S. Department of Education. But this isn't the paradigm that educators operate from, letting evidence guide their practices. So as translators of evidence-based practices, this is a barrier. People's minds aren't in a place to just readily absorb evidence, be consumers, and they be frontline individuals who are translators of what works. So that's where we're at the get-go when we start this type of work. Let's justify real quickly the need. One justification for the need. Is anybody familiar with the Matthew effect? This comes out of mainly educational research. Matthew effect is a biblical term that says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But that doesn't mean necessarily socioeconomically. What it means is those kids who come into the worst thing that can happen as a student in U.S. educational system, come in with lack of readiness. Lack of readiness in academics, lack of readiness in social readiness, lack of emotional readiness. Schools are not equipped to address kids' needs if you have lack of readiness. The Matthew effect basically shows the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The richer are those who come in with readiness. The poor are those who come in with lack of readiness. Basically, the differences upon school entry are small, whereby over time, the gap gets huge, juicy, and wide. And that's because of the lack of responsiveness. Not having a system and support to detect which kids lack readiness, which kid needs additional support. The traditional model in schools is, if you have a need, you must have a disability, we give you an IEP. So the prize is viewed as getting an IEP. That's what you get. Guess what the data indicate about special education? It's not so special. Actually, a lot of kids get worse. And that's supposed to be the prize? We slap a label. So we often call the traditional model of education the pursuit for the within-child problem. It's not about what supports we provide. It's all about the kid. The kid has a disability. It's something wrong with the kid. So let's move the kid out. We can't do anything to help the kid. Move them out of the system. The Matthew effect. And it happens in academic, social, and emotional domains. The next is just the pure need. We know these numbers. 20 to 25% of kids meet actually criteria for a psychiatric diagnosis. Yet, nationally, roughly 1% of kids are served under the category of emotional disability or emotional disturbance. Not saying all these kids need to have an IEP, but if special education is the intervention, 1% of kids were generally meeting their needs or attempting to meet their needs. Less than 15% of kids who need mental health supports get them outside of schools. Schools are called the de facto mental health system, whether we like it or not. This is where it happens, this is where it's going down, and if we want kids to access it and we want it to be kind of an equitable model, it should go down in schools. It's the common interface of communities. Over 1/4 of all children and adolescents are at risk for not being successful as adults for a host of reasons. So when we look at this, we also have a significant proportion of individuals who may not have a diagnosable thingy that we can call it, but they're not living a highly fulfilled, enriched life. This is what we call the dual continua of mental health. We have the deficit approach, then we have kind of the well-being side of things, the enrichment side. So there's a significant proportion of people who are not optimizing their experiences, who are not increasing their human effectiveness, who aren't living more time in kind of a happy, fulfilled state. So I'm really speaking about deficit statistics. We have a whole host of other things, and we talk about that from more of a positive psychology perspective. Basically, everything indicates these aren't individual kid issues, these are system issues. They're population-based issues that require a population-based approach. If you really look at it, it's a broken system. It's not a broken teacher, it's not a broken administrator, it's not a broken child, it's often broken systems. Therefore, there needs to be a system-level approach. What we know about the ingredients within systems, staff are underprepared and underskilled. What do teachers get in teacher prep programs? What do administrators get in administrative prep programs? We've done the evaluation of all teacher prep programs in the United States. How many of you would agree that you need some level of skill to manage group behavior in order to ensure engagement? What percentage of teachers do you think get a formalized course in that through their training? Nationally, less than 10%. We point fingers at teachers, fingers need to be pointed at prep programs. Are we equipping people with the skills to be successful? Underskilled, underprepared. Then we think about what are the in-service and pre-service trainings we're giving to administrators, teachers, school psychs, counselors, school social workers perhaps, if they're in the system. Are we giving them the skills to be successful? Wait to fail model. The issue is if you're struggling, you must have a disability. So the pursuit is to conduct a comprehensive evaluation to label a kid versus having a proactive service delivery model in which we try to support the well-being of kids by empowering the school with practices that enable kids to be more successful. It's a wait to fail model. Mental health problems are unaddressed. Yes, teachers to talk about kids with internalizing problems. They say they're docile, quiet, and still. They are a pleasure to have in the classroom. Just completely unaware. Unmet needs that go rampant. Many students report disliking their school experience. We call this classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is you pair school with repeated negative experiences whereby you can mention school, the kid could be on vacation far away from school and you say the word school and the kid has a negative emotional reaction. That's called a conditioned emotional reaction. How does that develop? negative experience, repeatedly experienced in school, whereby you don't even have to be in school, and that you have that toxic effect. Number one predictor of school dropout. I love these systems that states create, all the warning, red flags, who's going to drop out. How about ask the kids? It's the number one predictor of truancy. Truancy is then the next predictor of dropout, pulling the plug. Just ask kids, what do you think about school? This sucks. I hate this. I don't feel connected, supported, or whatever. Good predictor. We don't ask kids. We have to have all these kind of other data mining attempts. Too many students lack foundational skills for life success. The educational system is hyper-focused in many ways. Reading, writing, math, being able to regurgitate basic information about science, social studies. How many of you would agree that someone could read, write, and do math, but still struggle in life? What skills are necessary to be self-sufficient, productive members of a society? I guarantee quickly, if we did a kind of like a turn to your partner and talk, you'd get beyond academic skills very quickly. And I'm preaching to the choir here. But these are the types of conversations we have to have about what's the underlying reason, purpose, what's the why behind education? Why are we doing it in the first place? And we'll talk about how do we shift beliefs when it's hyper-focused on academics. And if this kid's interfering with my ability to deliver academics, he needs to be gone. He needs to be removed from the system. And this is where we get the overuse of punitive discipline practices that actually exacerbate problems for kids rather than serve to ameliorate them. School dropout rates are too high. 28% nationally drop out. Does anybody know the data on a dropout? The percent are likely to be incarcerated within 2 years. Over 75%. Speaking the logic, like if you don't have a diploma, you try to make it, and let's say I work at a fast food place, I try to pay my bills, it's not adding up. What am I going to turn to? Most crime is functional. I'm not talking about violence. I'm not talking about, harming others. Most crime is functional for people. It's about survival. It's highly predictable, and that's why you get the often used phrase now, the school to prison pipeline, because educators contribute and solidify kids' trajectory on that pipeline to prison. Unintentionally, though. Unintentionally. It's about not knowing what to do. It's not vilifying the education system or educators. It's about a lack of knowing. It's a lack of a service delivery framework that's targeted to addressing kids' needs rather than labeling kids. Currently, the system is about labeling kids. If you have a problem, we gotta say you have one of 13 handicapping conditions, and we gotta get you an IEP. And that IEP is gonna cure you. Because we're gonna just write goals on it, and so allegedly these goals are gonna translate into magic. It's completely flawed. It doesn't say what practices to implement. It just says what goals do you specify. It doesn't say how are you actually going to improve the well-being of the kid. It's just a goal document. So we all know this. Mental health impacts performance. How many of you have some mental health baggage or junk going on? You're not your best self. Let's think about another thing. How many of you get bad sleep? You wake up, you're groggy, you're a little bit more edgy, moody, cranky, if you will. Your performance lags. We have to convince others that mental health impacts performance, period. It impacts performance in whatever domain we're performing in. It just so happens we ask kids to perform in school-related tasks. Mental health is going to impact performance. On the positive side, for the betterment, being more focused, ready, able to take on challenging tasks, self-regulate, those types of things, or it can be to their detriment. Pulling away. Having such a low threshold for challenging circumstances that they escalate and harm relationships with others and so forth. So we know this. This is the link. Mental health is fundamentally related to academics. Mental health is educators' best ally in terms of achieving the things that they are trained to value. Those are the things they want to achieve. That's how we have to draw the connection between how mental health and academics collide. So we know there's a need. The need isn't necessarily with a certain kid or a few kids on campuses. It's a whole school issue. So it requires whole school change. And the way to look at this is from an implementation science perspective and look at systems change. So if we think about what a system is, it's an orderly combination of parts that interact to produce an outcome. If those parts are flawed, they're disjointed, then the outcome, the byproduct of what's going to happen is going to be limited. So we think about what are the parts. The parts are the students, the educators, the teaming, the policies, the site and central administration that goes on. Often what we do is we come in, hey, I got an evidence-based practice, I'm going to take it to this school. Working with the teachers separate from the administrators. There's no district policy that's behind it. There's no central administration involvement. And we wonder why we go and deliver our trainings, we try to transfer, and then we go back in a year's time or 6 months, there's no remnants of it at all. Because we haven't thoughtfully looked at it as a system. What are all the parts? What do we have to entertain in order to move this effort forward so it actually sticks, becomes a kind of a culture of that system, and ultimately, has that sustainability. Here's how we operate. If you look at, the fixin' implementation science, it fits very closely with that. We emphasize belief, knowledge, skills, and procedures, but prior, we secure these things. Make sure there's ongoing support. What we mean is coaching, feedback loops, monitoring, leadership. Is this part of the vision for the system? Is this communicated with this? Is there a sense of this is where the train's going? Either hop on or get off, the train's going, and we'd love you to be a part of this. Getting leadership on board, and then making sure the resources necessary to carry this whole process out. And then we talk about the internal, what we consider establishing the beliefs, training people in the knowledge, giving them the skills to carry it out, and then proceduralizing this within the school, codifying it within the school. When things are done, by whom, what does it look like? And this is the process. When we consult with schools, ethically, we don't do one-day trainings. I don't. Unethical. If I'm going to go in and take a school's money, precious money for that, and deliver a one-day training on something, yeah, I can do that for my own financial advantage. We require that they sign up for a minimum of 2-year initiative. We call it an initiative because it's not a training. It's an initiative we're rolling out. We meet with schools on average 8 days per year in order to carry that out. It's what it takes in order to move it forward if you want to change a system. I'm yet to uncover any project that's been conducted in humanity that's a systems change where it's, hey, we can come in 2-day training, we are so potent and magical in the words we use that people just absorb the skills and just go mechanically do it. If you do that, you're onto something. It's a process, it's not an event. So it's an unraveling of this. So it takes planning, it takes stakeholders, it takes doing this, because I'm going to be showing the multi elements that go into it. So beliefs are important as a precursor, and I'm going to spend most of my time talking about beliefs. How do you establish beliefs? Then you introduce the knowledge. So we actually have belief surveys, and we look at pre-post changes in beliefs, and we go by the 80% rule. 80% of staff's beliefs have to be supportive of the change in effective practices in order to then start. And we go there. So we spend time chiseling away at beliefs. Schools do this. They have feedback elements. We give them the tools to actually hold activities, reflective practices about what you believe as an educator. Why do you believe that? Why does science treat a belief as a hypothesis? That's why science developed. A belief is just a hypothesis. So if you believe that. Okay, what's the counter hypothesis? What's the evidence say? To really get people to put their beliefs out on the table, reflect upon them, and consider why do they think. Skills, competency, how-to, the practices, coaching, building skill fluency. Having coordinators or multiple coordinators who do the coaching when going in, modeling the practices, having rubrics whereby we take someone to observe someone else who's doing it skillfully and point out why they're doing it well. Then having that other person go in and provide feedback to the person who's learning, feedback about how well they're doing, the coaching support that's necessary. How many of you are familiar with the Joyce and Showers meta-analysis? Basically, dissemination. You give people knowledge, kind of a theoretical discussion. You look at knowledge gained, implementation, or use. Knowledge gained is like 5% through just theory and discussion. Implementation, use, 0. Theory and discussion, but with role modeling. Knowledge gained jumps up to 50%. Use, 0%. You add those elements and put in coaching, you literally go up to nearly 100% knowledge gain and 95% use and implementation. So this idea of bringing people in and talking to them, and then getting them to role play in a contrived way isn't necessary to translate into actual use under natural situations and circumstances. It involves coaching. And then proceduralizing this. Protocols, policy, accountability, and monitoring. We do often, is anybody familiar with Bob Pianta's work, My Teaching Buddy? It basically, you pair teachers, it's a co-professional development, they work with each other, you give them rubrics, they go, so it's not like non-evaluative, it's not like an administrator, so they're mutually supporting one another in the implementation, the fidelity of some of the practices. You have administrators, they do walkthroughs, this is all educator speak. Walkthroughs are part of administrative. You give them the rubrics so they can go and engage in an informative process to increase staff's skills and bring it up to speed. And that's kind of what we mean by the proceduralized, and that's ongoing. It's relentless, it's continual, and it keeps going. So here's the model. Staff beliefs impact student outcomes, but how do they do that? They do it through the adoption of effective practices, whereby if you increase staff beliefs, you're going to increase the adoption of effective practices, and you'll get better student outcomes. The student outcomes are the ultimate goal of evidence-based practices. We're trying to improve student lives and experiences and well-being. Then this is the mechanism by which it works. And so what we've done is we've conducted some studies, and we're in the write-up of all these. And I'm going to just go over some of the belief. So the first study we conducted, to what extent do educators' beliefs predict school-wide student outcomes above and beyond the socioeconomic status and diversity of the students in the school? Because basically most people would argue, poor schools, people are going to have worse beliefs, more affluent, they're going to be more positive and have better beliefs. So we wanted to control for the effects of the socioeconomics of the school as well as the diversity characteristics and see if beliefs predict above and beyond. And what we found was beliefs predicted, the beliefs of the educators in terms of how supportive. I'm going to talk about what some of these beliefs are. Predicted academic achievement, punitive discipline. More supportive, less punitive discipline. Student perceptions of school climate. More positive beliefs, more positive school climate as viewed by the students. Aren't they the ultimate consumers? I always laugh when we ask teachers to rate or administrators to rate their school climate. Who's the consumers? Why are we creating that environment? For who? Ask the students, student voice. Like, what do you think about school? Well, it sucks. What do you think about school? You know what? I'd rather be in school than anywhere else. Wow, that's pretty telling for a teenager to be able to say that about. What do you think when you pick your head up off the pillow in the morning before going to school? What are your thoughts? Oh, I think anything but going to that place. Or, you know what? I'm pretty excited about going there.
Can I ask you how you control how you create a control for these things? Like, how do you get around the socioeconomic diversity issue?
So we measured it. We just basically did SCM, and we did kind of, in SCM, it's like the multiple regression type of approach, whereby you're going to load and control for socioeconomics, and we just use kind of rudimentary free and reduced lunch indices of socioeconomics. And then student diversity, it was basically captured by percent non-white. Yeah.
And this was cross-sectional?
Yeah, exactly. So we have some longitudinal. So we have 4 studies we've done to just show, like, starting point is beliefs. So I'm gonna go systematically through those 4 studies. So the first was, like, are they predictive of anything, of use? Well, they're related to everything. And usually the 800-pound gorilla is this one. It's used to explain away anything. No, it's all socioeconomics. If you just give them money, then everything's gonna be. It's not, no, it's about what the adults in the setting believe. And we ultimately, it buffers students from the effects of poverty. What the educators, what they believe about their roles and about kids, buffers kids from the effects of poverty. And I'll show you additional data where we demonstrated it closes the achievement gap. Remember, it's the beliefs in and of itself don't. Beliefs coupled with effective practices do. Beliefs are about readiness, willingness to adopt and implement effective practices. Because a lot of times, it's about asking people, this isn't going to be easy, but it's the right thing to do to support kids. Where are you in on believing that? And you have to work in getting people willing to say, you know what, it's gonna be a little bit harder, but it's the right thing. In my professional role, this is what I have to do. Just like as a parent, how many of you are a parent? Is it easy? Is it the right thing to do? To step up after you worked hard man, the last thing I want to do is sit and play this stupid game is what the thought in your mind's going. But you step up and do it because you're modeling language, you're building secure attachment, you're there to do it for a bigger purpose. Your reward is for a bigger purpose, but you have to step up. It's not the easy thing to do often. So to what extent do educators' beliefs shift as a result of strategic activities, and that should be that focus on beliefs? Pre, 55% of staff had supported beliefs. Post, and I'm going to model some of the things we do. We have no prescriptive way like motivational interviewing, do these things and you. This is all experimental stuff. So you'll get a taste of how we're going after beliefs, and a lot of it is just getting people to reflect. Most educators don't sit and reflect constantly on why do you believe what you believe. And getting them to reflect, most people are going to gravitate in the right direction. And so this is what we've been able to experience, and this is over 280 schools across multiple districts. This isn't just like, oh, in these 4 schools we were able to, no, this is across multiple schools, across multiple districts. To what extent are educators' beliefs associated with the achievement gap between students of color and white students? Low beliefs, high beliefs. In these studies, we did nothing to influence the beliefs. This was before we've done anything. But we just disaggregated according to those schools that have high beliefs, meaning supported, those schools that have low beliefs. Look at the achievement gap. Man, those students of color, I don't know if they can learn that well. They're dealing with too much stuff. Or they bring more problems. And you know, my job is to deliver instruction. If those problems are delivering my instruction, they don't belong in my classroom. Just imagine how those beliefs play out. It contributes to the achievement gap. It's one of the biggest things we tackle within our country. The achievement gap, closing the achievement gap. How about we get people to just tell us what you believe? What's your purpose? How are you supportive? What are your thoughts about equity? Why are you even here? Why have you chosen your life path as a profession to work with kids? Do you realize you're working with kids? Do you know who they are? And I'm kind of like being kind of confrontational here. That's not how we deliver, but those are the things. Do you know who you are? You're going to see we try to use humor. We try to use kind of weird reflective examples that maybe highlight a point. And the last thing we want to do is conjure up defense mechanisms as we're asking people to be vulnerable, to reflect, and kind of throw it out there. You know, the last thing we want to do is make someone defensive. We've defeated the entire purpose. They're closed. To what extent are educators' beliefs associated with fidelity of implementation of a multi-tiered system of support targeting mental health? Beliefs are significantly related to the fidelity of implementation. We have a whole rubric that evaluates the multi-components through implementation of screening practices, through implementation of universal supports like school life key, positive behavior supports, and adoption of a social emotional learning curriculum, the extent to which staff build positive relationships with all their students, the extent to which the school attempts to address the physiology of students, preparing them for learning in terms of curriculum targeting sleep hygiene, stress inoculation practices, and maintaining good diet and exercise within the, so we look at it very broadly. It's not like, I'm sure many of you are familiar with school-wide PBIS. It's like this narrow approach. It works, but is it the only way to think about what we consider universal prevention in our schools? We try to take an empiricist view and not a behavior analysis view, or I'm a cognitive therapist view. We look broadly, theoretically, about what are the most important practices. Here's some examples of beliefs that we go after and measure. Schools can function as a safe haven that buffers children from adverse circumstances that lie outside of school. So we have a variety of things that look at that. We'll ask teachers, hey, if the kid comes from a chaotic home, is there anything you can do to help them be successful? If a child's misbehaving in your classroom, who's primarily responsible? The parents? It's the number one belief barrier. I call it the blame game. Across the US, the number one is blaming the parents. What can I do if the parents are screwed up? And you'll hear this, attend a school-based meeting, you'll hear it, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I like to spin it and go, the apple may not fall far from the tree, but that tree's in an orchard. And what I mean by that is the notion of multi-generational disadvantage. And if there's inertia to disadvantage, what can overcome that? It needs an external force. What other external force other than the school is best to overcome that multi-generational disadvantage process? So how do we stop it then? Well, society relies on schools and not magic. Fairness isn't everyone getting the same thing, but rather everyone getting what they need to be successful. Fairness is getting what you need, not saying everybody has to be treated the same. Because one of the issues with school service delivery, it's a blanket approach. Everybody gets it, and if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, well, that's not us. You must have a disability. Because it's not our school practices. You're learning disabled. Here's what really got RTI in schools. It all came from academics. There are 7 large-scale national studies. We took kids who were identified with a specific learning disability. They were called disabled. They had meetings where they convinced the parents that your kid is unable to learn. Here's what happened. They gave these kids instruction that's capable of being delivered in general education. What proportion of kids do you think responded so well that you could remove those remedial supports and the core curriculum took over? 75%. Is that a huge false positive rate? 75% of kids who are called disabled weren't disabled. Ouch. So our system is about labeling, and it's not about supporting. And this is where RTI and multi-tiered systems say, whatever, you may need a label in order to get more money to address the kids' needs, and we're going to have ways to determine when that process. That's all special education is viewed as in RTI lingo. We need more money to help us address the kids' needs, rather than we have to do this comprehensive evaluation to call it something. We have to convince a kid he has this condition. There are several states that are adapting non-categorical methods to education. meaning you don't call it anything. There is no classification. Basically, there's a point at which you've exhausted all efforts, interventions prior to that, and you need more resources. That's what special education is viewed as. Doesn't that make more sense from an educational context? We're not DSMing kids in schools. Our goal isn't like insurance billing, per se. So, changing beliefs. I'm going to go ahead and model some of the stuff I do. So I'm going to act as if you may be teams of educators, okay? But these are some of the things we do. And one thing we do is we say, what would happen if? Okay, we got to ponder, what would education look like? What might be the problems if these things happen? They just so happen to be how education unfolds currently. So what would happen if time, money, and energy were spent on practices that do not have any evidence of whether they actually work to improve child outcomes? What if school systems actually devoted a lot of their time, energy, and money to programs, approaches, strategies that they had no evidence that they actually help kids? Guess how decisions are made in most educational systems? Commercial companies call, they say, hey, trust us, we have it, there's no data to support their use. What if educators made really important decisions about kids based on gut feelings, hunches, or best guesses? There were no kind of data to consume that were defensible and objective. Do you think we'd get issues of minority disproportionality? Do you think biases, unconscious racial stereotypes, issues of cultural mismatch might play out? But this is, the teacher referral system works. Student, I just come up, I think there's a problem, I'm going to make a referral based on my gut feeling and hunch. And then I'm going to say, hey, have you tried anything? Yeah. Is it working? Sure, I don't know. There's no data, there's nothing. It's just on gut feelings. It's not saying schools aren't making strides with this. I'm talking on average, nationally speaking, that's what's happening. Implemented a one-size-fits-all approach to meeting the needs of all kids. Just blanket. Man, what would that school system look like? What might be the problems with that? Believe that every student who struggles in school has a disability and needs to be in special education. Do you know what the classification rate nationally is for kids with IEPs? Up above 15%. Do you know what the real number should be closer to? 7 to 9%. 7 to 9%. And where are these kids educated once they have IEPs? Are they just included, or are they often excluded from the process? Here's another way we do it. So a big question, what skills are babies born with? And this is a trick question, because skills imply learning or experience. What are babies actually born with?
Hunger.
We call these what? So crying, we don't have to teach babies to cry, right? They just kind of come out doing it. They can suck. I didn't have to, for my 4-month-old daughter, model that. She just kind of did it. Grasping, you can put your finger in the palm and the baby grasps. We got the good old rooting reflex. So what these are all innate reflexes, instincts. It just so happens babies are born with a finite amount of these, but collectively they enable survival. So they're important, right? But there's actually a small amount of these. Here's the issue. Every other repertoire of skills must be learned. So at any point in a child's development, whether they're in early elementary, middle school, or high school, if a person doesn't possess a skill, what do we have to do? Because they weren't born with those skills. So if we have a high schooler who doesn't know how to read, what do we have to do? They weren't born, it's not a natural thing, instinct. What do we have to do? Teach. What if we have a kid who can't get along with peers, just hasn't had the opportunity to have those things modeled well, just doesn't have overall good interpersonal effectiveness? And this is really to the detriment of the kid. What do we need to do? What if we have a kid who constantly just loses it over the smallest things and is regretful but can't manage emotions, doesn't have the skill? What do we have to do? So let's reflect on how well our schools are at actually, when we identify kids who don't have skills, how good are we at teaching those skills that they don't possess? Teaching is different than lamenting. Schools are good at lamenting deficits, but they haven't created a service delivery model to actually systematically teach when they identify kids lack particular skills that they need to be successful. So this is one way we try to get them. Are children and adolescents just miniature adults? So this is one way we talk about it. It just so happens everybody will say no. But in educational context, we treat and expect adult-like decision-making and behavior out of kids. I'll say it another way. Actually, individuals, humans, that have underdeveloped brains. And one of the more important parts of the brain, in terms of making good decisions, weighing consequences, self-regulating, inhibiting responses, the prefrontal cortex. When is that developed? So we talk about the issue that we're working with kids, and we have to often keep our expectations in check. So what's our goal as educators? It's not to just say, hey, these kids are biologically. We can put supports and strategies in place to artificially serve as their prefrontal cortex. What do you think self-monitoring protocols are? We're overcoming kind of frontal lobe limitations. The kid's not self-regulating. Well, give them a self-monitoring program whereby they reflect and record their behavior. And they're made aware of it. Helps with self-management. It's ran by the kid. So kids who are deficient in that get that level of support. But we have to all agree that kids aren't miniature adults. They're just short in stature. And we can just do anything with them and expect anything out of them. Does knowing how to be successful in one setting mean you know how to be successful in all others? So would someone crack open a beer in their place of worship? So I put in the word beer. So if you're faith-based of any type, would you bring in a six-pack and just start cracking open beer? Or have most people learned certain codes of conduct, unless you go to church here, which meets on Friday nights, and it's kind of fun. But most people learn codes of conduct. I actually, imagine if you could take the religious and have all the boundaries evaporate and you just watch people engage in those practices out of context, how weird it would look. But once it's in a church, it's not weird, right? Or it's in a place of worship. You learn what leads to acceptance and success in that environment. And just because you can be successful in one environment doesn't mean you can be successful in all others. Do we behave the same at work as we do at home with our family? Obviously, this lady does, because she's like nap time and decides to just take a break. Which then has an obvious segue into a discussion of curling. Because this is the most obvious discussion when we have this. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to parallel the curling hall to the school experience for certain kids. How many of you have never curled in your life? You only know it as the weird Olympic sport. You sit and watch it for 5 minutes and you go, seriously, how's this Olympic sport? Like, really? They said no to a bunch of other sports, but they're letting this one in. So, you've never curled. So let's think about it. And just imagine students who don't know how to be successful at school. What would you need to be successful in the curling hall? What would you depend on in order to be successful?
A really good brush.
You would need the materials. May you need a good coach. And what I mean by a good coach, someone picks you up, points out what someone's doing well. If you make a mistake, doesn't yell at you or reprimand you, but dusts you off and says, hey, you could do better next time. Watch how I do it. Would you, the first time you do it, be really good at it?
Unlikely.
Unlikely. How many people love things they suck at? How many of you are planning this weekend to do multiple things that you're just royally rotten at? Like, oh, I'm going to start out with this thing I'm horrible at, and then it's followed by something I'm worst at, and it's going to be amazing. Generally, we have a higher affinity for things we're better at. May you need an incentive to show back up. Some type of lure, or what I call a here kitty kitty approach, to bring you back. And as you come back and you develop greater proficiency, you buy your own broomstick, you have your own rock, and so forth. So think about when kids aren't successful in school, what tender care they need in order to help code shift or switch to be successful. The same process as someone new to a curling hall is the same thing certain kids need in school. They need that level of care from us in order to get it. Yet that's not what we do with kids who aren't getting it. What do we do for kids who aren't getting how to be successful in schools? Then we would have people reflect on practices within the school that actually push kids away from school rather than pull them in. And that's an activity we do. Just going over some of these. We talk about this. How many of you are a parent? This is the biggest lie in society. And it's a myth. That because most parents, when they're going into parenting, this is the vision they have of a child who's always going to be like this, the Gerber baby image that pops up into their mind. It just so happens a lot of the time you spend isn't necessarily in just this euphoria, just smiling, happy, soothed. You get a lot of different things. This is Hollywood at its finest in terms of what's wrong with this picture? What's not real about it?
No one's crying or falling over.
Yeah, why isn't this one puke on his chest? Why isn't she pulling her hair? Why isn't this one have poop coming out the back? I mean, that would be a real picture. But we have these kind of myths that operate. It's like the dad with his son playing catch. That is what he's envisioning when he's going to have a son. I mean, this is kind of the images that go in people's head that often don't match the reality. The reality is you get the P's. Puke, pull, pinch, pout. What else? Just P's. You get it all. This is why a lot of parents who are into it really are at their core. Because the reality doesn't match the myth that was going on in their head. The same thing happens in education, and I draw a parallel. There's a myth about what type of student should come. What we say in schools, educators should all over themselves. Kids should do this. The parents should be doing that. That should happen. Should. Instead, we try to transform. We need to do all over ourselves. What are we going to do to enable this kid to be successful? What are we going to do to create a better communication system with the family? What are we going to do is a different way than should. So we try to eradicate should. It's a powerless position when you make a should statement. It removes yourself out of the equation. Then what can you do versus a do statement? So the mythical student is obviously every kid that goes through our system achieves this, right? They're all just happy going on to Ivy Leagues or coming here to UW, top of their class. The mythical student is always the one who raises his hand all the time, listens to the teacher just devoutly, gives the teacher nice things on a daily basis, loves to read, has a deep passion for math, and I mean just writes volumes independently without any nudging, wants to write, has this deep desire, cooperates well with others in small groups, appropriately uses technology unsupervised. That's what they do. Loves to do homework. Such a desire to do homework, runs home to complete homework, is clean, abides by the dress code, has tons of friends, shares well with others, plays well on the playground, goes on to win awards, and don't they all go on to be productive adults? Every single one of these students, they should. If they're not, that's their problem, right? The reality about many of our students, whether we like it or not, here's what students are bringing to the educational table. Is the school ready to handle the diversity of needs that are coming your way when you open up the school door? Or have you a service delivery model where students should come like this, so we're going to address the should students, and then if it doesn't work, then it's not our fault. It's someone else's fault. Someone else in society has to clean it up. And they do when these individuals become adults. Look how much money we spend when school systems really fail our communities. Society cleans it up. They do clean it up. So the reality about a lot of kids aren't necessarily inherently interested in everything that's happening academically. They're not always nice to their teachers. Some cheat, some steal, some lie to get out of trouble, which is a natural human tendency. Some can't read, some can't do math, and many hate to write. Many don't use technology appropriately. Many don't go home and immediately do their homework, go figure. Many don't say nice things, some are dirty, some don't abide by the dress code actually. Many don't have friends. Many use fighting as a way to solve problems. And an astonishingly significant number of our kids that go through our school systems are unsuccessful as adults. So then we engage in practices to think about, who do you really teach? And if you could create an effective school system and you were the emperor or empress of the school system, what would be the supports that would be in place to meet the range of needs that might come your way, whether you like it or not? So that's a glimpse. We have all kinds of other belief activities. Again, we use assessments to figure out where beliefs are before we even start to get into what it is. We don't even get into what it is. We don't even want to conjure up resistance. We simply state on what's your beliefs, why do you believe that, and what's the ultimate purpose, and what would school look like if we actually did fully meet the needs of kids. And we functioned in ways that communities want us to function. So RTI is basically an educational term to talk about the public health model. It's the public health model in education in terms of levels of prevention. We call it RTI in education, response to intervention. It's now also called multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS. You could call it the public health model in education, you can call it RTI, you can call it MTSS. The idea is basically this: an equitable and proactive service delivery framework that consists of providing a continuum of evidence-based supports and making decisions based on data and not these flawed hunches, guesses, or opinions. There's a bunch of research on how imperfect educators' decision-making is, and it says educators' decision-making is as good as a coin flip in terms of accuracy. 50-50 chance whether it's an accurate decision. Yet there's all kinds of things to say, hey, what do you think? Well, I think this kid, can't be successful in this classroom. I think this kid he needs to be suspended for 5 days. Although it's the third time they've used that same approach and it's not working. Go figure. So within this, goals are both to prevent and promote. So it's not just a deficit-based model, it's a promotion model. How do we give kids who are even seemingly doing well access to skills that can enable better success, optimizing their effectiveness? Cultural responsiveness, working to adopt a culturally responsive lens or approach to work, and grounding in the notion of making decisions upon that which is evidence-based. And then this is all about school culture and climate, but it's about common vision and common practices. Right now, what wins out in most school systems are fiefdoms. What I mean by fiefdom is each school may operate its own thing. Within the school, each teacher does its own form of education. So there's no common language, there's no common practice, there's no common. So we often say developing a common, standardized, yet flexible system that allows for individuation, but it has common ingredients in terms of what works. So here's the full functioning RTI model, and these pyramids can keep being extended. So in education, like other professions, we like triangles. It's just like triangle, triangle, triangle. But here's how we think about it. Tier 1, universal, this should be rocking. We're trying to prevent problems from ever emerging in the first place. We kind of know that. Universal screening practices are proactively implemented 3 times per year. They're done with valid screeners that have been looked at in terms of technical adequacy, classification accuracy, and established a cutoff score that educators can use. They have to be brief and inexpensive. We've developed screeners that can take an elementary school literally 15 minutes and they can screen their entire school. And we've established all that. They're free. We didn't make these to commercialize them and charge school systems money. We developed them to be free and access so people can carry out the screening practices. Tier 2, secondary or what, targeted, whatever you want to call it. It's the additional layer of care that you're going to pray. We're going to progress monitor student response. It's about creating a menu. Screening doesn't tell you what the kid needs. So here's an example in academics. You screen, let's take reading. You screen, identify who needs supports, and then you do what's called assess down the skill hierarchy to teach up. It's tailoring instruction. So in reading, if I screen and find you're at risk, I would then look at, do you possess reading fluency? If you can't read fluency, then it might be a matter of lacking phonics. If you don't lack phonics, it could be phonemic awareness. If you don't lack phonemic awareness, you're over kind of letter sound and letter naming abilities are weak. So you can tailor instruction. You keep getting the core curriculum. So the same thing needs to be here. You use a screener and then you have an assessment that tells you what the intervention. So we've developed methods, it's called the student intervention matching form. Really brief, and it says what intervention would likely be effective for you. And we've looked at data comparing whether you haphazardly assign an intervention to a kid versus matching a kid to the appropriate intervention. Do you get better effects? And we have a whole host, there's 7 kind of evidence-based tier 2 interventions. You progress monitor the person's response, and tier 3 is more kind of individualized care. Whether it's a function-based behavior intervention plan for a kid who has more behaviorally driven problems, or some type of therapeutic supports in the form of cognitive behavior therapy for kids with emotionally driven issues. We also consider home-based supports and so forth if needed. And that's tier 3. Only upon non-response to that do we consider you may have a disability. And we don't even use that. We say a condition that requires more services, that costs a little bit more money. And so that's when the traditional evaluation to identify someone as eligible would come into the practice. And then once you're in special education, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's about creating a continuum of care. I've worked at Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska, which is a residential treatment facility. They have another pyramid. When school systems of kids' mental health needs and issues rise to that level, they don't provide a one-size-fits-all. They have a continuum of care in that philosophy, in that setting. So it's about serving all. For the sake of time, I'm just going to get to the 7 big ideas of RTI that we get up and running. Again, this is over 2 years. In many school systems, we work for 3+ years. Year 1 is what we call trying out. Year 2 is building to scale. Year 3 is programming for sustainability. So we spend those 3 years building that to scale. So number 1 is multiple tiers of support, and here's what we get and train people over the course of that. Tier 1, as you can see, isn't just one practice. This is everything we train in. Relationships, we teach people, educators, actually, how do you build? You'd be surprised how many people they can say it's important, but they don't know how to build a relationship with someone. What's it mean? What do you do? How do you do it? You got to lead people to water. How do you actually build time to build relationships with all the kids? Not just some, all. Proactive classroom management. We have 16 evidence-based standalone kernels of classroom management. We get teachers to adopt and use those, including the good behavior game. We factor into that. Good behavior game is one of the most effective classroom management strategies ever developed. The data on it is almost unbelievable because it's so simple, but it produces huge effects. Progressive and restorative response. If you have to respond to problem behavior, how do you do so while preserving a relationship with a kid? How do you correct behavior in a way that you maintain the relationship? And if you had to discipline because it rose to that level, what are the restorative practices you're doing on the tail end to repair harm? Reconnect, repair, and restore. Most people, schools, engage in discipline and do nothing to reconnect, repair, and restore with the kid. So we talk about what are effective progressive response systems. We train in the prompt approach, which is evidence-based, and it's a sequence that takes little kernels. Number one, proximity control. Number two, do a redirection tactic. Make sure you're ongoing monitoring. So if the kid gets behavior on track, you can reinforce in the right direction. P is a direct verbal prompt. T is a standardized teaching interaction in which you begin the interaction with an empathy or validating statement. So you keep the kid's frontal lobes there. Evidence-based, we all know this. Basically, we want to avoid these things. These are the things that get implemented in kids' IEPs. Erland lenses, a piece of the puzzle for reading problems, learning difficulties, ADHD, dyslexia, diarrhea, famine. It literally, you go on the site, it says it's evidence-based. People aren't good consumers. This cures all those problems, and it's used to treat kids. We all know, so there's just the vulnerability of educators. There's this nice little thing on CBS. When my child eats some marijuana brownies, he calms down, has an appetite, makes no noises. This is, what do you think's happened? Stoned. Oh my God. But this is the vulnerability. As practitioners, parents, people are vulnerable because they want to solve problems. And so people know that's what business people do. They market to that vulnerability. And so you have to build good evidence-based consumers or they're just going to adopt anything. And that's the approach there. We know this. It's still the most widely supported drug prevention program, but it actually, some studies indicate kids are more likely to abuse substances. It doesn't just take a cop in a cool police car to skid up and go, hey, don't do that. You know, meth is euphoric and but don't do it. You know, it makes you feel really good, but don't. It's not enough. Modality matching, we have this, learning styles. 40 years of research. People self-identify with this. I'm an auditory learner. I'm a visual learner. No data to support it. It's still rampant. This is what gets written in and people do to address problems. Well, we got to teach to their modality. Well, it has a lot of intuitive appeal. It just so happens it doesn't improve outcomes. It doesn't work. But this is what takes the place of over other effective practices. The one study that really undermined this, they actually countermatched. They took auditory and matched them to visual and took visual and matched them to, and then the countermatch group did better than the modality consistent group. That's kind of counter to the whole idea. And that's in addition to, over 50 studies that they couldn't find positive outcomes. I'm gonna have to stop there. I hate to stop there, but I have to catch an airplane. So if there's any questions I could field for maybe the next 5 to 10 minutes, I'd be happy to do so.
You've done in these Seattle schools?
I've been working, trying to influence school systems in the local area. So I'm working with probably 6 different school systems on different levels and trying to get leadership to commit, because again, it's that systems change. If you don't work internally to get leadership to agree on something, it undermines. You get torpedoes, whereby there's oftentimes schools will start an initiative and then the other stakeholders weren't involved and then it just goes nowhere. So it's like a waste of money, time, resources, and so there's a lot of efforts going on to try to get things happening. Yeah.
Where are something like school-based health centers fit in here? I mean, you're talking about, really kind of training teachers more broadly, but so some of these.
No, it's training everybody.
Training everybody.
Everybody. Administrators function, so we ask everybody to transform their roles. And so student health centers often function as a vehicle to deliver various practices. RTI is just a framework. It says not all kids' needs are the same. So we have to create multiple tiers so we can address, so student health, they're saying student health can do in terms of universal promotion for all, educating kids about things for physical health as well as stress, managing stress. Then there can be tier 2 supports for kids whose needs go beyond that. So I often view them as vehicles through which you can deliver the continuum of practices. So they're nice in allowing that and bringing that to life. So that's how we use that. So RTI is just a school-based framework through which any service could be delivered and rendered. It just so happens the criteria is make sure it's evidence-based, and then at what point, is this something that for all, some kids, or a very small number, a few of the kids? So that's how we think about RTI, all, some, few. And then in that, it's like those providers saying, okay, is this something all kids should have access to, some whose needs go higher, or is this for a few who really are kind of our main at-risk kiddos? All right, thank you.
Thank you.